The footage that is circulating through every newsroom on the planet right now will be remembered as the moment the American century officially ended. Watch it carefully. Watch Donald Trump push back his chair at the NATO summit table in Brussels. Watch him stand up while 31 other world leaders sit in stunned silence. Watch him button his jacket, mutter something about disgrace, and walk toward the exit while the cameras capture every furious step. The door slams. The echo reverberates through the chamber. And then something happens that no American president in history has ever witnessed, because no American president has ever been reckless enough to make it possible. The remaining leaders do not panic. They do not chase after him. They do not beg him to return. Instead, they look at each other. And in that moment of collective recognition, a decision is made that will reshape global security for the next century. The bully had finally gone too far, and the room knew exactly what needed to happen next. 90 minutes later, the Secretary General of NATO steps to a podium and announces that the United States of America has been indefinitely suspended from all NATO decision-making bodies, intelligence-sharing networks, and strategic military command structures. On paper, America remains in the alliance. In practice, the Pentagon has just been locked out of the organization it created 76 years ago. Every American commander in Europe is now cut off from NATO radar systems. Every American intelligence officer is now excluded from Allied briefings. Every American strategic planner is now operating blind in a theater they once dominated. Donald Trump walked into that room demanding $400 billion. He walked out with nothing. And in the time it took him to fly back to Washington, the world order his predecessors built was dismantled by the very allies he tried to extort. This is not a diplomatic setback. This is not a negotiating position. This is the most catastrophic foreign policy failure in American history. And I'm going to show you exactly how it happened, who failed to prevent it, and why the man now flying back to Washington in disgrace has just handed America's enemies the greatest gift they could have imagined. The summit was called 3 weeks ago under emergency protocols not invoked since September 11th. Russian military formations had been detected massing near the Baltic borders. Intelligence indicated a limited incursion was probable within 60 days. The purpose was to coordinate unified deterrence, to show Moscow that aggression against NATO's eastern flank would be met with full alliance force. 32 leaders cleared schedules. Defense ministers prepared briefings. And then Donald Trump arrived 45 minutes late. Watch the footage. The other leaders are already seated, visibly frustrated. Trump walks in without apology. He takes his seat, and before the Secretary General can open the session, Trump begins speaking. He does not mention Russia or the Baltic states. Instead, he pulls out a paper, slides it across the table, and announces the United States is owed exactly $400 billion for military protection. He gives 90 days to pay. If they refuse, Article 5 is worthless. An attack on one will no longer be treated as an attack on all. The room goes silent. Let me show you the receipts of what happened next, because the chain of events that followed will be studied in diplomatic academies for generations. Receipt number 1, the resistance. The French president was first to respond. He pushed the paper back and told Trump that France does not pay tribute. The German chancellor stated the demand was incompatible with collective defense principles. The British prime minister suggested the alliance should focus on the actual threat facing members. But the moment that broke the dam came from the Polish president. Poland, the nation carved up between Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia in 1939. Poland, the country that has spent its modern history caught between hostile powers. Poland, the ally that hosted American troops and invested heavily in American weapons because it believed American promises. The Polish president stood up, looked directly at Trump, and spoke words that will echo through history. If America will not stand by us, we will stand without America. The room erupted, not in chaos, but in sustained, deliberate applause from leaders who had spent years quietly resenting American arrogance. Trump's face changed. He had expected the ultimatum to produce fear. Instead, he was watching his leverage evaporate. The Polish statement gave every other leader permission to resist. It transformed the moment from negotiation into revolt. Receipt number 2, the walkout. What happened next was pure Trump, unable to process the coordinated resistance, unable to adapt to a situation where his threats had no effect. He defaulted to the only move he knows: escalation through spectacle. He stood up, declared the summit a disgrace, and announced that the United States would not participate in what he called a shakedown by ungrateful allies. He walked toward the door. His aides scrambled to follow. The cameras captured every second. And here is what Trump did not understand. He thought he was demonstrating strength. He thought the walkout would terrify the remaining leaders into capitulation. He thought they would send envoys chasing after Air Force One, begging him to return and offering whatever concessions necessary. He was catastrophically wrong. The moment that door closed behind him, the dynamic shifted completely. The obstacle was gone. The bully had removed himself from the room. And the remaining 31 leaders, freed from the need to manage American ego, could finally act on what they had been preparing to do for years. They looked at each other and recognized that Trump had given them exactly what they needed: a justification for independence that the public would understand and accept. Receipt number 3, the 90-minute revolution. What happened after Trump left is being reconstructed from multiple sources. The Secretary General immediately called for an emergency procedural session. The French delegation had anticipated Trump might attempt something destructive. They had drafted contingency resolutions. Within minutes of his departure, those resolutions were on the table. The proposal was unprecedented: indefinite suspension of the United States from all NATO command structures, intelligence networks, and strategic decision-making bodies. American troops would remain under bilateral agreements. America would technically remain a treaty member, but the integrated command structure coordinating everything from nuclear deterrence to cyber defense would be closed to American participation. The vote was unanimous. 31 nations voted to lock the United States out. The Baltic states voted yes. Germany voted yes. France and the United Kingdom voted yes. In 90 minutes, 76 years of American military leadership in Europe was erased. Now let me explain why this happened so quickly, because the speed of the decision reveals how isolated America has become. Trump believed he was negotiating from strength. He believed European dependence on American military power was absolute. He believed no matter how outrageous his demands, allies would comply because they had no alternative. He was operating on assumptions that stopped being true years ago. European leaders have spent recent years quietly preparing for this scenario. They watched Trump praise Vladimir Putin during his first term. They watched him threaten to abandon NATO repeatedly. They watched him return to office promising an even more transactional approach. They drew the obvious conclusion: American protection was conditional, subject to whoever occupied the Oval Office, and could be withdrawn at any moment for any reason. So they built alternatives. The European Sovereign Defense Initiative was already creating independent command structures. Intelligence sharing agreements between European services had been strengthened. Alternative communication networks had been established. The infrastructure for a NATO without American participation already existed. It just needed activation. Trump's ultimatum and walkout provided the political justification to flip the switch. The Allies had been waiting for exactly this moment, the moment when they could act without being blamed for breaking the alliance. Trump gave them that gift wrapped in his own arrogance. The man who saw this coming, who helped build the infrastructure that made the European response possible, was watching from Ottawa as his strategy reached culmination. Mark Carney has spent years positioning Canada as the bridge between European and North American security. He understood that if America abandoned its allies, those allies would need immediate alternatives. He facilitated defense industrial partnerships between Canadian and European manufacturers. He established critical mineral supply chains bypassing American control. He positioned Canadian forces to fill gaps in Allied coverage. When the suspension vote was taken, Canadian representatives voted alongside European partners to exclude the United States from the alliance America created. Carney did not push Europe toward this moment. Trump did that himself. Carney ensured that when the moment arrived, the transition would be orderly rather than chaotic. He turned American self-destruction into Canadian strategic opportunity. While Trump was flying back to Washington in disgrace, Carney was already on the phone with European leaders discussing the next phase of Commonwealth-European defense integration. The global reaction is something you need to understand because the shockwaves are reshaping everything. Look at the markets. Within an hour of the announcement, the Dow plunged 1,400 points. The dollar fell sharply against major currencies. American defense stocks collapsed as investors calculated the cost of exclusion. But the financial impact is secondary to the geopolitical realignment now accelerating. In Moscow, Russian state media celebrates what they call the greatest victory in diplomatic history, achieved without firing a shot. Putin issued a statement expressing hope for a new era of European security cooperation. In Beijing, Chinese diplomats are reaching out to European capitals with proposals for expanded security cooperation, infrastructure investment, and strategic dialogues designed to fill the vacuum. The multipolar world that China sought for decades is being handed to them by an American president too blind to understand what he was destroying. What does this mean for you? If you are an American watching this unfold, you need to understand that consequences will reach into your daily life. American military bases in Europe employed tens of thousands of service members and supported hundreds of thousands of jobs. Those bases now exist in strategic limbo. Service members remain, but their integration into Allied command has been severed. American defense contractors who built business models around NATO interoperability face existential crisis. Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon derive billions from European partnerships now frozen. The dollar's reserve currency status depends partly on American security guarantees. When those guarantees are revealed as unreliable, demand for dollar assets falls. Your purchasing power erodes, retirement accounts shrink, imported goods cost more. Trump's temper tantrum in Brussels will cost American households real money for years. So what happens next? Here are the three scenarios unfolding. Scenario A, the humiliating return. American corporate and military pressure forces Trump to seek readmission to NATO structures. He sends emissaries offering apologies and concessions. The allies agree to conditional reintegration with strict limits on American veto power. Trump claims victory while accepting terms previous presidents would find unthinkable. America remains in NATO, but as a diminished partner, never again trusted with the leadership it once commanded. Scenario B, the permanent fracture. Trump retaliates by withdrawing American forces from Europe entirely and imposing economic sanctions on allies who voted for suspension. NATO splits into competing structures. The Atlantic alliance that won the Cold War ceases to exist in any meaningful form. Russia and China exploit the division to expand their spheres of influence. Scenario C, the new architecture. The suspension becomes permanent. Europe and Canada build fully independent defense structures. Japan, Australia, and South Korea align with the new bloc rather than unreliable Washington. America finds itself isolated, militarily powerful but allianceless, its influence reduced to whatever it can achieve through pure coercion. The post-World War II order is replaced by something new that America is not invited to join. This is how hegemony dies. Not through enemy attack, not through military defeat, but through a single afternoon of arrogance in a conference room in Brussels. Donald Trump believed American power was so overwhelming that allies would tolerate any abuse. He discovered that allies have limits. He discovered that decades of goodwill can evaporate in moments. He discovered that the door, once slammed, does not automatically reopen. The footage of his walkout will be played in history classes for the next century. Students will watch and wonder how one man could be so certain of his leverage while being completely blind to its absence. They will study the 90-minute session as a case study in how institutions respond when they conclude a relationship has become irreparable. And they will note that the architect of American exclusion was not an enemy, but the American president himself. The mainstream media will frame this as a diplomatic crisis that can be resolved through negotiation. They will suggest cooler heads will prevail, that institutions will find a path forward. Do not believe that framing. What happened in Brussels cannot be undone with a phone call. The suspension is not a negotiating tactic. It is a structural change to the global security order. America's allies have concluded that American leadership is too volatile to trust. That conclusion will shape their decisions for decades, regardless of who occupies the Oval Office. The alliance that won the Cold War, that stood united through decades of challenge, has been broken by its own founder. And the man responsible is probably, at this very moment, still convinced he was right to walk out that door. Drop your thoughts below. Did Trump destroy NATO, or did NATO finally stand up to destruction? Stay vigilant. Stay informed. You just watched 76 years of American leadership end in 90 minutes.